everyone, and welcome to our 15th weekly segment. It is the 2nd of February, 2023. There haven't been many military changes recently. Nothing big has happened since Solidar on that front, but there have been some diplomatic changes. Last week we discussed Britain sending Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. Since then, the United States has agreed to send M1 Abrams tanks, and the Germans have agreed to send Leopard 2 tanks. This will be extremely important if Ukraine wants to launch another big offensive soon. Now, this is particularly important because it seems like Putin's current strategy is hoping that the West will become exhausted with supporting Ukraine, and eventually it will become too domestically unpopular to continue doing on a large scale. Tanks would allow Ukraine to shift away from the war of attrition that's currently going on, and at least in theory, retake large amounts of territory quickly, and make serious gains in the Donbass region without resorting to the kind of trench fighting which has become increasingly common both in the region as a whole and specifically around Bakhmut. Inside Russia, the Moscow-Helsinki group has been shut down. Established in 1976, it was the oldest human rights activist group in Russia. In the same vein, the liberal independent news organization Meduza has been declared an undesirable organization in Russia, which will make it technically illegal to work for it, to share any of its articles, or to give it interviews. Meduza formerly worked in Russia, but has since moved to Latvia. The Duma is also considering passing a law that would allow military personnel to be jailed without trials or court involvement. This would be focused on things like desertion and not showing up for military duty. So we have seen this week a very public and in some ways almost performative increase in repression by the Russian government. One frequently speculated reason is that Russia could be preparing for another round of mobilization to prepare for a spring offensive, but I think it's most likely that this is just about clamping down on internal dissent, particularly at a time when the state is feeling increasingly vulnerable and under threat. Russia's Levada Center, the main independent polling center in Russia, has released a new set of polls this week. We're going to look at the two of them that specifically pertain to the current circumstances. Now we'll start with the question, how would you evaluate 2022? And the answer is more or less what I expected, but that does not make it any less surreal and shocking. So 14% of respondents said that the year had been good, 30% said it had been bad, and 55% described 2022 as average. And the other interesting one is about fears of the populace. Fear of a worsening of the regime and a return of repression both hover at around 30%, but the number one after illness is world war, to which 54% of respondents said they were afraid. And this makes sense, right? It's wartime, Russia is actively at war, and there's programs on the television every day. Solovyov is talking about nuking Paris, nuking Berlin. So it would be reasonable to assume that it would have gone up. But according to the poll, Russians are less afraid of World War now than they were in 2021. To be completely honest, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that yet, so I'm not going to comment on it much, but I did think it was worth mentioning. And while we're talking about polls, let's talk about Putin, his approval rating, and how best to measure it. Now, Levada gives his approval rating for January of 2023 at 82%. Does that mean that 82% of people in Russia think that Putin is doing a good job? And to preface this, I'm going to be drawing heavily on Chapter 4 of Timothy Fry's book, Weak Strongman, which I cannot recommend enough. I'm hoping to do a special segment soon looking at some of the best books on Russia, but that is for the future. Now, the consensus in the popular discourse is that the polls are not real or representative. People live in fear of the state, there's no freedom of speech in Russia, so how can we trust these polls? They're nonsense, ignore them. Now, that isn't necessarily the view for all polls, but specifically Putin's approval ratings and approval ratings for the government more generally. Now, Fry and several co-authors have conducted surveys designed to prove otherwise, and have published a paper based on their findings which I find very compelling, and I would encourage you to seek it out. It is titled, Is Putin's Popularity Real? And their surveys put his popularity at around 80% for that year, while the Levada Center was saying, I believe, 86%. But we've talked about before the distinction between Putin the person and Putin the symbol. Now we are looking here at what I believe to be Putin's approval rating as a symbol of the Russian state. What might it look like if we could get Putin's approval rating as a politician? Now there are a few different ways to look at this, and I think we should take a look at all of them and try to find a happy medium in between. First is the approval rating of the government as a whole. Government as it is not necessarily created by Putin, but it is enabled by Putin, and without Putin at the top, it would be different. So do people approve of the government? Yes. The latest data is 68% approval for the government. There's also the polls we touched on earlier about how Russians viewed 2022 and the results of it, which were largely average or negative. That I want to dismiss because there are a lot of factors on that, and it would be dismissed by many people probably as a result of outside factors rather than things that were under Putin's control or even under the government's control. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it would be, I think, very easy, and many people would blame outside powers, specifically America, for causing these problems that make this year bad or average instead of good, rather than blaming Putin. So if you do buy into the narrative that a lot of the problems that make this year bad or average are the fault of outside powers, then it wouldn't make sense for that to reflect on Putin's approval rating. It might even raise it, because look, he is going forth and doing battle with these malicious outside actors and preventing them from destroying us, and if that has a cost, then we have to deal with that. So, in my opinion, the best indicator that we can look at for Putin's popularity as a politician are the polls on which parties people would support. And the support for Putin's party, United Russia, by latest polls is at 36% of people would vote for them. So 36 isn't exactly a good approval rating because it's not a yes or no, it's a poll between different options. The Communist Party and the Liberal Democratic Party are at 11 and 8% respectively. These parties tend to be fairly pro-Putin and align with him pretty well in most cases, so I would consider including them in the rating. If we're going to look at this from a party's perspective, I think that makes sense, and that would bring him up to around 55%. So we're looking at somewhere between 36 and 55. I am not entirely satisfied with this way of looking at it, but I think it's probably the closest that we will get to an authentic look at Putin the politician if you take away the symbolism and the presidential role. Polls in Russia are a strange and complex topic, but I hope at least some of this made sense and seemed reasonable. This has been our 15th weekly segment, and thank you for listening.